Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel, Horror and Heroes. And today I'm going to unlock for you the ultimate watch list of the Friday the 13th franchise. Up until a few years ago, there was only one way to enjoy the blood, guts, and explicit content of these films by watching Friday the 13th. 1 through 10, Freddy vs. Jason, and the reboot. But now it appears, with the help of the online community, new paths have taken shape, allowing you to enjoy this franchise on more consistent and enjoyable terms. First, we must realize that there are actually two main story arcs. The first one is what I call the Tommy Jarvis era. The other is the New Blood era. And when combined, they tell a much more intriguing and consistent story. So follow me as I show you the paths that will lead you to the ultimate Friday the 13th watch list. But before we get into the theatrical part of the story, we are going to learn some history about the main characters that appear in the films in order to better understand the time in which each film takes place. The history I am about to share was pieced together by research done through comic books, and of course the movies themselves. So let's begin with the first lady of the series, Pamela Voorhees, who was born in 1930. 5 years later, the Christie family opened up Camp Crystal Lake. In 1946, Jason Voorhees was born to Pamela Voorhees and Elias Voorhees. Now, between the conception of Jason and the events of the summer of 1957, Elias Voorhees vanished. And in 1957, Pamela Voorhees took a job at Camp Crystal Lake as a cook, with Jason in tow. Just 1 year later, this deformed young man, Jason, drowned in the lake, causing the camp to close. In 1959, Alice Hardy was born. To Mr. and Mrs. Hardy, you will meet her in Friday the 13th, Part 1. Elias has a child in 1961 without Pamela, and the child's name is Diana Voorhees. Years had passed, and in 1962, the camp was reopened for 1 summer. Everyone in the camp was murdered, and this is what had earned the camp's moniker as Camp Blood. In 1965, Chris Higgins was born. In 1968, Trish Jarvis was born. You'll meet her in Friday the 13th, Part 4, along with her brother, Tommy Jarvis, who was born in 1972. Then, in 1980, Tina Shepard was born. You will see her in Part 7. And now we're ready to begin our ultimate guide to Friday the 13th. The first film in the franchise, Friday the 13th, was released in 1980 and starred Betsy Palmer as Pamela Voorhees, Adriana King as Alice Hardy, Ari Lyman as Jason Voorhees. In this, the first installment, a group of teenage camp counselors attempt to reopen Camp Crystal Lake in 1980, despite its blood-soaked past, but are hunted by a mysterious killer. Here, we meet Jason's mother, Pamela Voorhees, and our first main protagonist, Alice Hardy. The second film in the franchise, Friday the 13th, Part 2, was released in 1981 and starred Betsy Palmer as Pamela Voorhees, Adriana King as Alice Hardy, Warrington Gillette as Jason unmasked, and Steve Dash as Jason masked. The second installment takes place in 1985. 5 years later, Camp Crystal Lake has been closed, but there is another camp opening on the lake. But it's still Crystal Lake to Jason. And Jason is ready to kill for Mommy. In this film, we will get to see the conclusion of Alice's story. And then we will jump forward in time approximately 5 years to a new camp called Camp Kakanak. And it is opening a stone throws away from Camp Blood, and Jason is coming the counselor. The third film, Friday the 13th, Part 3, 3D, was released in 1982 and was released in 3D, the only one in the series to do so, and starred Dana Kimmel as Chris Higgins, Paul Kratka as Rick, and Richard Brooker as Jason. This entry begins right where the previous film leaves off in 1985. Jason stalks a group of unsuspecting friends who decide to spend a weekend at a cabin near Crystal Lake. Here we bear witness to a massacre that takes place at an old cabin called Higgins Haven, a place owned by the Higgins family on Crystal Lake. Here we get to see Jason don his iconic hockey mask. The fourth film, Friday the 13th, Part 4, The Final Chapter, released in 1984 and starred Kimberly Beck as Trish Jarvis, Corey Feldman as Tommy Jarvis, Jonah Freeman as Miss Jarvis, and Richard Brooker as Jason. This film takes place directly after the events of the last film. After being pronounced dead and taken to a morgue, Jason spontaneously reanimates and escapes the hospital where he is being held, and stalks the Jarvis family and a group of friends renting a house on the lake. Here, we witness the end of Jason's week-long murder spree, but also the start of what I call the Tommy Jarvis era. Jason is in top form, but he seems to meet his match when he encounters 12-year-old Tommy Jarvis, who refused to cower from Jason and does what needs to be done. The fifth film in the series, Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning, was released in 1985 and starred John Shepard as 17-year-old Tommy Jarvis, Melanie Kinnaman as Pam, and Tom Morga as Jason Voorhees. This one takes place in 1990, 5 years after the events of Part 4. Tommy is still haunted by his past experience and is a ward of the state at 17. He is moved to a halfway house near Crystal Lake. A young man dies shortly after his arrival. Is it a coincidence, or has Jason returned? In this film, we get to see Tommy return at age 17 and do battle with Jason once again. The sixth film, Friday the 13th, Jason Lives, which is one of my personal favorites, was released in 1986 and starred Tom Matthews as Tommy Jarvis, Jennifer Cook as Megan Garris, and C.J. Graham as Jason Voorhees. This film takes place in 1991, 1 year after the events of Part 5. Tommy Jarvis is back, and he means to exhume Jason's body and cremate him, but in a strange turn of events, reanimates him, and Jason makes his blood-soaked path back to his home. Up to Tommy to finish what he started. This is where we see Jason become truly part of the undead immortal community. Tommy is now 18 years old and has escaped the mental facility, armed with supernatural knowledge and a thirst to end the reign of Jason. This is where the story also comes to the fork in the road. In order to see where Tommy's story truly ends, we must follow two other films not originally conceived of during the franchise's original outing. The first film that follows Tommy Jarvis's path is a fan-made film found on YouTube. Friday the 13th Vengeance was released in 2019 and starred Kelly Tapan as Angelica Jarvis, Sine Lutzis as Ashley Jarvis, C.J. Graham as Elias Voorhees, and Jason Brooks as Jason Voorhees. In this film, set 30 years after the events of Part 6, we begin with Elias Voorhees, Jason's father, returning to Camp Crystal Lake, and the murders begin to follow. After hearing the news of the killings, Tommy Jarvis goes missing. Now it's up to Angelica and Ashley Jarvis to find their father in the midst of finding a way to kill Jason. Here we get to see the children of Tommy and Megan grown up, and a new player emerges as Elias Voorhees, Jason's father, and the return of Jason. Which brings us to the final chapter thus far in the Tommy Jarvis timeline. Friday the 13th, Vengeance 2, Bloodlines, released in 2022 on YouTube, and starred Kelly Tapan as Angelica Jarvis, Sine Lutzis as Ashley Jarvis, C.J. Graham as Elias Voorhees, Jason Brooks as Jason Voorhees, and Tom Matthews as Tommy Jarvis. This takes place a few months after Vengeance Part 1. Elias Voorhees is back and has plans for his son Jason that involves ending the Jarvis line once and for all, and to bring back Jason's mother. In this film, we get to see the father and son dynamic between Elias and Jason, and the return of Tommy Jarvis in an epic battle. Will Tommy finally meet his maker, or will he end the Voorhees bloodline for good? And that concludes the Tommy Jarvis arc for now. But also leads me to the second part of my ultimate Friday the 13th watch list. The second era, entitled New Blood, starts with the seventh film in the franchise, taking us into a more sci-fi horror tone, and will only focus on 3 of the franchise films, and 1 fan-made film to tie this timeline together, leaving only 3 movies as standalone in the franchise, and those films are Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. I chose to remove this film from this list because it quite simply does not fit the story or the mythos of the character himself. In this film, Jason leaves Camp Crystal Lake for no reason to go on a cruise to New York for 15 minutes of the film, and although it has some good kills, it just doesn't fit the modus operandi of the usual Friday the 13th films. The second film I chose not to include is Jason X, because although it feels like a Jason film and has an interesting original take on the ultimate killing machine that is Jason, it does not fit series. In this film, Jason is removed from the Crystal Lake testing facility, where he has been cryogenically frozen for over 445 years, and brought to a space station full of unsuspecting victims. And the last film I chose not to include was, of course, the reboot from 2019, Friday the 13th. This is a well-made modern reboot of Friday the 13th. If you have not seen it, I would recommend you give it a watch. Now let's move on to the films I did include in this, the second part of my ultimate watch list. I call the New Blood era, with the 7th film. I guess I'll take over from here, considering he will meet his end at the end of this list. Friday the 13th, The New Blood, was released in 1988 and starred Laura Park Lincoln as Tina Shepard, Cherry Kaiser as Dr. Cruz, and Kane Hodder as Jason. This film takes place 10 years after Part 6. A telekinetic girl tries to raise Daddy from the dead, but frees Jason instead, and now it's up to little Miss Sunshine to put Hamburger Head back in the lake. In this film, we meet 17-year-old Tina Shepard, who uses her powers to first resurrect little Mr. Meathead by accident, then tries to put him down with them. Will she win against old Wormhead? Find out. The next film isn't part of Old Meat Sack's main line of movies. It's a fan-made film called Friday the 13th, Roseblood. Rosebud. Rosebud. And was released in 2021 on YouTube and and starred Laura Park Lincoln as Tina Shepard, Terry Kaiser as Dr. Cruz, Kent Broden as Duke, and Jason Brooks as Jason. Roseblood takes place 13 months after Part 7. Tina Shepard is being held at the Crystal Lake Research Facility, but Tina isn't the only one with powers there. There's another named Rose, and they are followed by a special government strike team who is on the hunt for Jason. In this film, we follow Tina and Rose, who are meant to use their powers to capture Jason. But if they fail, the fast strike force is ready to handle the deed. But can they do it? Can they capture him? Find out. The next film is Friday the 13th, Part 9. Jason Goes to Hell. The Final Friday was released in 1993 and starred Erin Gray as Diana Kimball, Steve Williams as Creighton Duke, and Kane Hodder as Jason Voorhees. This film takes place shortly after Roseblood, and Jason's supernatural origins are revealed. In this film, Jason gets blown into pieces, and his soul is released, and he needs a next of kin to body jump into before it's too late. But don't worry, I get his soul in the end. Which brings us to the conclusion to my ultimate Friday the 13th watch list. Freddy versus Jason. Freddy vs. Jason was released in 2003 and starred Robert Englund as Freddy and Ken Kirzinger as Jason, among others. And in this movie, Jason and Freddy go at it like Thunderdome. 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. So which one is it gonna be? Freddy or Jason? And if you are thirsty for more Freddy vs. Jason, check out these comics, which take place around the same time as Jason Goes to Hell, and this film right here, Freddy vs. Jason. The first is Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, a 6-comic miniseries full of blood and guts and fire and gore, released in 2007 by Wildstorm in DC. And check out its sequel, Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, Nightmare Warriors, released in 2009 by Wildstorm in DC. If you like this video, you should love the next one, Ultimate Nightmare Watch List. Comment, like, subscribe.